Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the second Coil of Bahamut Turn 4, also known as Turn 9. This is the final raid boss made available by patch 2.2 and draws to a close this chapter of Final Fantasy XIV. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your dungeon guide. Please note that we have chosen to use a one-tank strategy. This guide will be focused on handling mechanics with that in mind. However, I will be remarking on the two-tank strategy throughout the fight. The main mechanic of Phase 1 comes from Stardust. This cast will target any random player except the main tank and mark them with either this red symbol or this yellow symbol. When the symbol disappears, a meteor will drop in the location the player was standing in at the time. The fall of this meteor will do room-wide AoE damage based on proximity to the fallen rock. As long as you're not standing underneath the meteor when it plops, this damage is easy to manage. The color of the marker correlates with the type of meteor that will drop. Should a meteor be dropped closer than 8 yalms to a pre-existing meteor, it will explode and instantly wipe the raid. As such, meteor placement is crucial in this first phase. Each raid group will of course have their own pattern of meteor placements, and you should choose what works best for you. In our group, we like to line up our meteor drops with markings on the ground in between the waymarks A, B, and C. The distance between these 2 points is sufficient to ensure that the meteors will never be too close if placed correctly. Again, depending on your raid group's overall damage, you'll see anywhere between 3 to 6 meteors before the phase change. Ideally, in order for you to meet the DPS check required in later phases, you should be pushing into phase 2 with absolutely no more than 6 meteors, but aim for 4 meteors. Now let's take a look at the main tank crunch in phase 1. Along with a frontal cone, tanks and healers need to be on the lookout for Raven's Beak. Beak will slam the tank with a hard-hitting blast and apply a 12-second debuff that will detonate and destroy anything in range after its duration. Both the initial hit and the resultant debuff explosion are monstrous, and tanks and healers need to be ready with their specific cooldown rotation, including stone skins and abloquiums. Depending on how fast you push through this phase, tanks will have to deal with 3 to 4 beaks before the phase change, so plan your cooldowns accordingly. If you're using 2 tanks, you can stack more cooldowns together and tank swap after each beak to minimize active tank damage. The next major mechanic you'll see in phase 1 is the Iron Chariot Thermionic Beam Wombo combo. Nail will jump to a player at range and cast Iron Chariot, a point-blank AoE and knockback. You may have noticed that the outer perimeter of the arena has turned into deadly fire lasers, and getting knocked into it will result in a swift death. Avoid this as necessary. At the same time, Nail will mark up a random player with Thermionic Beam, shown by this marker. After finishing her Iron Chariot cast, Nail will immediately hit that player with Beam. The raid needs to stack up and split the damage from this. The easiest way to handle this is to ensure that the raid is spread out around the room anywhere but the middle, to bait the Iron Chariot somewhere to the side. Once the chariot goes out, all players can collapse into the middle to share and heal through Thermionic Beam. Nail will then resume her assault on the main tank by smashing down on them, dealing damage in an area around the tank. This will happen multiple times throughout the fight, and anytime she disappears, all players need to be especially wary not to be near the tank for when she reappears. Next up, we'll see Lunar Dynamo. This is a mid-range attack that will heal Nail minimally for each player or pets that get hit by it. The easiest way to avoid this is to be either in melee range or at maximum range. Following your first Lunar Dynamo, you'll see Meteor Stream. Nail will disappear and mark up 4 players with these purple marks. Shortly after, Nail will slam into these people, dealing damage to them and anyone around them. As soon as Nail disappears and the Meteor Stream begins, all players should spread away from each other. Any Meteor Stream that follows Lunar Dynamo will be a single set of damage. However, every other meteor stream, 2 sets of streams will hit 2 sets of players. The danger here lies in if the same player is marked for meteor stream twice in a row. Healers need to top them off in between each hit, or chances are they will die. Let's do a quick recap and look at the mechanic rotation of phase 1. First up, Stardust is cast, followed by Raven's Beak. Remember your cooldowns. Stay away from the middle until Iron Chariot and then collapse in for Beam. Nail will crash back in and another Stardust is cast. Next up, Lunar Dynamo. Don't stand at mid-range and then spread apart for a single meteor stream. Nail will crash in again and cast Raven's Beak. Another Stardust leads us into a double meteor stream. We follow this into another beak and another meteor plopping down. At this point, you should be nearing the start of phase 2. If your DPS is a little slower, you'll notice the phase begin to repeat with Iron Chariot, Thermionic Beam, Dynamo, and meteor streams. At 65%, Nail will enter phase 2. In this phase, she will teleport to the center of the room and become invulnerable. Here, we'll deal with with adds and the meteors we've dropped so far. As soon as Phase 2 begins, 3 non-healer random players will be marked with these green marks. These markers work in the same way that the meteor marks do, but instead will drop meteors that turn into golem adds. We position these 3 golems at each waymark close to the outer edge of the arena, far away from any pre-existing meteors. Everyone else will stack in the middle of the room, away from the blast of the falling meteors. Moments after the green meteors drop, 3 golems will spawn from them. The colors of the golems will denote what abilities they have. The green golem is a hard-hitting golem with a spicy frontal cone. This golem should always be tanked away from the raid. He also has the ability to cast Demolish, a hard-hitting raid-wide AoE. We prefer to avoid this completely by destroying him first. The blue golem will cast Magnetism, pulling anything within its vicinity onto itself, including players, meteors, and other golems. He will also cast Earth Shock, a massive raid-wide AoE that places a non-dispellable paralyze on every player. Again, we definitely prefer to avoid this and interrupt it when necessary. Finally, the red golem will cast Earthen Heart, a targeted ground AoE that will leave behind a void zone. This cast is hard-hitting and places a bleed debuff on anyone it hits, so make sure you're not standing in the poop. This golem will also cast Heavy Strike, a staggered AoE that can be avoided by standing at range or behind the golem. After about 30 seconds into their spawn, Nail will cause any living golems to swap colors. The main idea behind Phase 2 is using the golem adds to consume the fallen meteors, clearing the platform for the next set of meteors and golems, and then doing it all again. Anytime a golem is within range of a meteor, he will consume it. Consuming a yellow meteor will increase the golem's haste, and consuming a red meteor will increase the golem's outgoing damage. Should a golem eat more than 3 meteors, he will heal, turn into a super golem, and you will wipe. Should 2 golems get too close together, they will merge into a super golem, and you will wipe. What the raid needs to do is assign 3 golem tanks to pick up each golem and feed them the appropriate number of meteors, all while keeping them away from each other. Sounds like fun, right? Again, there are countless ways to handle this, but in our group, we have the main tank pick up the green golem, turning him away from the raid and dragging him to the first set of meteors. Our bard picks up the red golem, and our white mage picks up the blue with arrow and healing aggro. These 2 paper tanks will keep their golems away from the others until the green golem has eaten and been destroyed. Our goal is to destroy the green golem before the colors swap. By doing so, we completely avoid the excess damage that comes from Demolish. With the timing of each golem ability, the golems will swap colors before they cast their next major abilities. That means the bard will now be tanking the blue golem, ready to interrupt any Earthshock casts. The main tank will then grab the golem off of the white mage tank. Each tank will drag their respective golems to their set of meteors while the rest of the raid burns each one down and avoids heavy strikes and earthen hearts. The goal is to clear all meteors and kill all golems before the next set of meteors begin. This happens 65 seconds after the first set of golems spawn, so DPS needs to be up to par. This set of meteors will sequentially mark up 6 players with meteor marks and won't stop until the last meteor mark is out. After the 6 meteors plop down, 3 players will immediately be marked by the golem marks. I've seen countless variations of meteor drop patterns for this set, and I cannot stress enough to experiment and do what works best for your group. Some groups just pick a point on the outer edge and run around the room until all the meteors are down. Others have fixed positions for each meteor. Whatever way you do it, make sure you are consistent with your placement and you leave yourself plenty of room for each golem meteor. Our group likes pretty patterns, and we drop meteors on one side of the room and leave the other side open for our golems, like so. Once the second set of golem marks are out, the raid collapses in the center again and waits for the golems to spawn. From here on out, it's a repeat of what you've just done. Each tank picks up their respective golems and feeds, while the rest of the raid dodges telegraphs and burns each golem. After around 70 seconds of the second spawn of golems, Nail will begin to cast Mega Flare. Should any meteors still be up at this time, they will explode and wipe the raid. If you've cleared all meteors, you are good to go into Phase 3. Shield and heal through Mega Flare and get ready for the hard part. At this point, Nail becomes active again, smashing down on the tank. She loses her abilities from Phase 1, including her cleave, making it safe to stand in front of her. From this point on, all of her crazy heavy-hitting attacks will only hit her primary target. The first and most important mechanic of this phase is Heaven's Fall. This will bring down a massive Allagan hunk of junk into the center of the room that will instantly kill anyone underneath it and knock back the rest of the raid a set distance, all while dealing damage based on proximity to the pillar. To avoid getting punted into the death wall, players should stand slightly outside of the center. roughly in this sweet zone. Each Heaven's Fall piece of junk will divide the platform into a different pattern of pulsing yellow zones. Standing in these zones when they explode will do massive damage and may kill you, so be sure to get into the safe zone as soon as possible. Each death zone pattern gets harder and harder to dodge, and ideally you will be pushing Nail into the last phase with only 2 Heaven's Falls, avoiding the hard patterns entirely. Moments after the first Heaven's Fall junk disappears, an ad will spawn that should be picked up by the tanks immediately. This ad has some pretty nasty primary attacks, and if you're solo tanking, be ready for that extra damage. The ad will also drop a fire patch on the ground that should be avoided. During this time, Nail will also afflict a player with Garrote Twist. This purple debuff will afflict the player with Garrote, a stacking debuff that will instantly destroy the player if it reaches 9 stacks, but is harmless until then. This debuff cannot be dispelled by the healers, and the only way to clear it is linked with the death of the ad. At around 50%, the ad will stop moving and instead cast Binding Chain on 2 players. Binding Chain will slowly stack Garrote debuffs on the affected players, just like Garrote Twists, only it will stop stacking the moment that the ad dies. As such, it's important to burn the ad down sub 50% to limit the number of stacks on the affected players. Upon death, the ad will throw out a large AoE that players should avoid. Shortly after that AoE, 3 small white circles will spawn around the area. These circles will remove any stacks of Garrote Twist and should be used by those affected players to clear their debuffs as quickly as possible, as they do despawn after a short time. Nail will cast another Garrote Twist before the next ad or phase change, and that player needs to be ready to clear before the circles disappear. Everyone needs to keep an eye out on their debuffs here, as it can land on any player. Shortly after that first ad dies, you'll get your second Heaven's Fall. This piece of junk will pulse out an alternating starburst pattern of yellow death. Stand in the safe zone, wait for the explosion, and step into the new safe zone. During the second Heaven's Fall, Nail will begin to harass random players with a ground-targeted AoE called Supernova. The Supernova cast will drop a black hole underneath the player that will do a massive amount of damage if not avoided, and can suck in nearby players, placing a heavy on them. Remember to stay away from the black holes of death, especially when you're dodging the yellow explosions. The phase change occurs at 47%. With 1 tank, you should have little trouble pushing into phase 4 before the next ad. If you're expecting 2 ads, remember to burn the ad, clear your 2 twists, and dodge Supernovas. At 47%, Nail will cast Bahamut's Favor, a stacking buff that will increase her outgoing damage. This acts as a soft enrage for the fight, and you want to down her before the damage gets too much to handle. At the same time, 3 elemental dragons will appear around the outer perimeter of the room in one of 3 fixed positions. Each dragon will afflict random players with specific debuffs that will be handled throughout the rest of the fight. The specific position of these dragons will also affect how we eventually handle the upcoming dive bombs, but we'll talk about that soon. Nail will be hitting its primary target with the deadly Bahamut's Claw. This ability will hit the tank 5 times very quickly, and tanks and healers should be ready with cooldowns. If you're 2 tanking, the second tank can revoke during Claw to minimize the overall damage. We'll see a few abilities from phase 1 make a reappearance here. In between the new debuffs we'll be juggling. Ice Claw will throw out an ice ball on the raid 1 player at a time until all players are affected by the Ice Bitten debuff. This debuff will make you deathly vulnerable to another hit of the same element, and can only be dispelled by the hit from the opposite element, in this case Fireball. Fireclaw will place a yellow line on a random player, indicating that they will be hit by Fireball in a few seconds. The Fireball will hit the player and splash around them, hitting them and anyone in range with a Fire Scorch debuff. This debuff will make you deathly vulnerable to another hit of fire, and can only be dispelled by a hit of Ice Ball. The idea behind these 2 debuffs is to control what you're getting hit by at what time, so that your debuffs cancel each other out before you're hit by the next set. It sounds complicated, but in reality it's quite simple to deal with. The group will be stacked on top of the tank at the beginning of phase 4. From then on, you will alternate every odd fireball out of the group. With the timing, this will cancel out the previously applied Ice Bitten debuffs. Every even fireball will stay inside the group, and the debuff will subsequently be removed by the next ice ball. Keep this rotation in mind, because we're about to throw another wrench into it. The third dragon will put up a Thunderstruck debuff every 10 seconds on a random player. After 5 seconds, this debuff will explode and do massive damage to anyone around the player while also afflicting them with Paralyze. However, it does nothing to the player originally afflicted, and obviously we don't want this debuff hitting anyone. The general idea in handling Thunderstruck is to have the affected player move out of the group immediately until their debuff explodes. The catch here is handling all of these debuffs appropriately while also handling Lunar Dynamo, Iron Chariot, Thermionic Beam, Supernovas, Meteor Streams, and the dreaded dive bombs. The easiest way to to learn this is to take it one step at a time. Here we're stacked up loosely in front of the boss so that we can see who is linked with Fireball first. Once it's up, that person runs behind the boss to minimize boss movement during Fireball. Once the Fireball is cast, that player can move back in. Thunderstruck will now debuff a random player, and at the same time, Lunar Dynamo will cast. Since we obviously don't want the Thunder player to get hit by Dynamo, they will be moving behind the boss in the same manner that the first fire out did. That way, they're still close enough to avoid Dynamo, but far enough from the raid to avoid hitting anyone. Dynamo will cast, Thunder will pop, and everyone can collapse back in for the next Fireball. You'll notice that the Ice Spit and debuffs will happen naturally and can pretty much be ignored since they'll be handled by the appropriate movement of the Fireball in and out. After the second Fireball in, we get everyone to start spreading around in preparation for the Iron Chariot Thermionic Supernova combo. The next person to be afflicted with Thunderstruck and Fireball here will already be away from other people, but keep an eye out for it anyway. Nail will cast Iron Chariot wherever she is being tanked, so tanks and melee be sure to move away. She will cast 3 Supernovas on 3 random players before casting Thermionic Beam, so it's important to remain loosely spread out until 2 Supernovas are out, and then collapse back in during the 3rd Supernova cast. You're trying to bait the Supernovas away from where you plan on stacking in for Thermionic Beam. During this stack up, you'll also be getting hit with another Fireball in, which is perfect timing. The Thunder goes out again, next fire is out, and we can begin to loosely spread in preparation for the dive bombs. To handle the dive bomb mechanic, we follow the same principle as that of turn 5. The goal is to bait the dive bombs to the outer edges of the arena, since most of the raid will be running for their lives through the center. Let's look at each dragon spawn. There are 3 possible orientations these dragons can spawn in ever. For example, since these positions are fixed, we know that if the dragons are in position number 1, these 2 will always dive first. This goes for the other 2 possible patterns as well. Since we know their set patterns, we assign one player to visually identify which dragon pattern we're dealing with and place waymarks accordingly. The first waymark in between the first 2 diving dragons and the second waymark to the left of the 3rd dragon. The assigned player should use cardinal directions and be able to quickly recognize the dragon patterns, so this may take some practice. Let's go back to where we left off previously. Here we are loosely spread in preparation for the first set of dive bombs. During this first set of dive bombs, you have 2 sets of meteor stream happening, so healers will need to be on their toes, and the raid needs to make sure they're not near anyone else. In our group, we bait the first dive bomb near the B waymark, and the second to C. The group moves towards B until the first dive bomb marker comes up. That person then runs to the edge of the arena near B until the marker is gone, then runs back into the center. At this point, the rest of the raid should already be loosely spread near C, waiting for the second dive bomb marker. Once the second dive bomb marker is out, that person stays near C, while everyone else begins to make their way back to B. Be sure not to run too far ahead or you'll run straight into that first dive bomb. Heal through the second meteor stream and get ready to stack back in after the boss has crashed down onto the tank. At this point, the phase resets and you handle the debuffs the same way. Fire out, thunder out, fire in, thunder out, etc, etc. As long as you keep up with the rotation, the debuffs should be super easy to handle. Remember to avoid Iron Chariot, bait the Supernovas out, and then stack back in for Thermionic. Your assigned dive bomb player will have remarked the new locations of the dragons by now, so keep an eye out for the new markers. On the next set of dive bombs, you'll be dealing with Dynamo instead of Meteor Stream. The group will move to B, wait for the first dive bomb mark, move to C, wait for the second dive bomb mark. Lunar Dynamo will be coming after the second dive bomb marker drops, so everyone needs to be neatly stacked in preparation for that. The person affected with the second dive bomb should prop sprint to reach the group in time to avoid getting hit by Dynamo. After that Dynamo, the rest of the fight is nothing you haven't already dealt with, as the pattern of mechanics repeats itself. Remember that the fight has an enrage timer of 13 minutes. However, if you've managed to reach this far with no DPS trouble, you'll be golden. And there you have it. Nail Deuce Darnus. Did I say that right? Maybe. Congratulations on your awesome new loot and buckle up for Savage Coil. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. As always, thank you so very much for watching. Till next time.